Дорогие друзья, большое спасибо, что вы пришли к нам сегодня в гости. Я сегодня просто тронута, потому что у нас в гостях Андрей Николаевич Драгомирецкий. Это сын Николая Драгомирецкого, который столько сделал для нашего музея, который отсканировал огромное количество материалов. Мы до сих пор пользуемся лифтом, уникальный лифт, который был сделан с 3-го на 4-й этаж. Ира Драгомирецкая меня привлекла в этот музей своим сердечным обращением. Так что, Ира, большое спасибо, приглашала меня и всю нашу семью на открытый... Как?
Открытый дом.
На открытый дом на Пасху. Так что, и вдруг у нас здесь оказался Андрей Николаевич Драгомирецкий, подполковник американской армии. Более подробно представлено в нашем приглашении, поэтому я не буду сейчас об этом много говорить, просто предоставлю ему слово.
Большое спасибо, Маргарита, за добрые слова. Я перейду на английский язык, потому что меня попросили этот доклад сделать на английском языке. Thank you very much, Margarita, for your very kind words and your very kind introduction. First of all, yes, I am a lieutenant colonel, and fortunately, to the joy of both my mom, my aunt, and my wife, I am now retired. That means I'm no longer in harm's way. What this presentation will be the road to Maidan Square. And it's not a physical road to Maidan Square, but a metaphorical road that started a very, very long time ago. And because in the military I worked as a psychological operator, I tend to look at history in a slightly different perspective. The perspective of what is the cause to various different events that actually happen. And what is the effect of that? Well, we definitely see the effect today. But we're not going to go into much detail about what's happening today within Ukraine. The period that we're going to be covering is from approximately 1,000 years. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail as to what specifically happened. But as you can see, the picture on the left, that is the christening of Saint Vladimir of Kiev in 987 AD. Old Rus, or Kievan Rus, actually started earlier. But in this particular case, the christening was a very small thing that happened in history. But it had massive reverberations. In the same way that if you drop a small pebble into a calm and quiet lake, there are waves that go all the way to the shore. And in this case, those particular waves in history are even prevalent in what is Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia today. As you can see by the picture, by the next slide. And also there is a causality, because this is also one thing that set some things in motion that made Maidan Square possible. So what you're seeing on the right side is the memorial to Maidan Square. All right, Kievan Rus. Am I missing a slide? No, I'm not. I haven't gotten to that. We need to take a look at what Kievan Rus, or Old Rus, was prior to 988. Everybody in the audience knows 988 was the christening of Rus, with St. Vladimir becoming Orthodox in 987. Why? Well, at that particular time, the real important country, as far as the Slavs were concerned, were the Byzantines. Why? Take a look at the take a look at the size of the Byzantine. Take a look at the size of the Byzantine Empire. It's big. And that was one of the global powers at that time. The other one was the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. It was a feudal society. what that meant that you had a number of city-states, and each particular city-state would have its own leader and its own influence. The other thing is that it was primarily a polytheistic society, meaning that there were many gods. The most prevalent, or the leader, was somebody called Rod or Rid. A lot of that would depend on what part of what part of this area you lived in. Yeah, in some areas it was Rod, in some areas it was Rid. But in all cases, it was the leader of the pantheon for the Slavs. The other one would be, as an example, would be Chornobog and Bielobog. It's part of our Slavic history, very, very far back, but it's still there. And in all cases, the Chornobog and Bielobog name remained consistent. But what it necessarily stood for was different. In some areas, it would be male or female, respectively, or day or night, or light or dark. The other one that I would bring up as an example would be Pirun. The best way to describe him is if you took Zeus from the old Roman times, and you took Thor from the Norse mythology, and you squished them together, you would have Pirun. And part of that is there was a lot of communication and borrowing of deities and during that particular time. There were many others, and there was also a number of mythological creatures that were very unique. But that's not the purpose of this presentation. The purpose is to kind of give you a setting of what it was. Also, being a feudal state, the various city-states were just as likely to team up to fight off an external enemy as to fight each other. Okay, we'll continue on, and on the Christianity. Everything changed. And this is also a change that lasted for close to 900 years. And the picture on the right is Patriarch Tikhon. And even today, there's Christianity in the Slavic lands. But even more so, this is the wave of that little pebble, it's starting to expand in history. And if you think the christening of the Slavs was peaceful, not necessarily, because the entire process took about 75 to 100 years. And in some cases, some of the cities resisted, some didn't. And in some cases, some of the cities wanted to force the old religion on the new religion. So there were a number of conflicts that happened during that particular time. At this, the next major event that had a lot of impact was something called the Great Schism, and this is when the church, Christianity, split into two major sects. Now, this is actually very, very important, and the map on the left over here shows you more or less what the split is and where it was. The map on the right, in essence, shows you what the Slav lands were from approximately 1200 AD, after the issue of what will be the dominant religion was in essence settled. Here's a couple of things that are kind of important. All right. First of all, take a look at where this particular split is, and then take a look at this border right over here. There is some correlation over here. And what we're starting to see is the formation of political and cultural Teutonic and also a religious Teutonic plate. This would be the equivalent to the American plate and the Pacific plate, and where their two meet and press upon each other, you're going to have conflict. Sometimes it's going to be resolved diplomatically, sometimes not so diplomatically. We're going to see that also. All right, the Slavs by this time, they're already up in the White Sea all the way down to the Black Sea. And that's kind of important. And the other thing is, if you take a look at the divisions of the maps, what you're beginning to see is the formation of regions, and some regions are starting to become a little bit, and some cities are starting to become a little bit more important than other cities. This entire Slavic experience, of Kievan or Old Rus comes to a screeching halt with the Mongols. If anybody doesn't know what the Mongols did, or the Golden Horde, I guess historically, I can make some comments, but they had a significant impact. They brought several innovations over to the West, or applications, new applications of in old inventions. One of them was the stirrup for the horse. The stirrup did several different things. The first thing that it did, it freed up the soldier's hands, or the rider's hands. That meant that the rider can put something else into their hands. For the Mongols, it was the short bow. Congratulations, they've just invented mounted archers. Now, with mounted archers, there's a new tactic. You ride up forward, shoot a few arrows, ride on back, shoot a few more arrows, ride forward, shoot a few arrows, until you run out of arrows, or you run out of, or the enemy is routed. And that is how they, in essence, conquered. Now, they didn't initially start going towards the west. They started going towards the east. And the first thing they ran into, the Pacific Ocean. Horses don't swim the Pacific Ocean real well. So, what they decided to do is to go south, until they ran into the Great Wall of China. All right? Horses don't jump 40-foot walls. That are about 10 to plus feet thick. Okay, so they continued on going south, and eventually they found the Slavs. And in this particular process, they ended up killing 20% of the world's human population, and this is including also the Americas. That's how brutal the Mongols were. The other thing that we want to take a look at is, well, Genghis Khan, and all of a sudden, Genghis Khan decides, I have to go back. What happened? Well, the Mongol ruler died, and there was a Mongol tradition to pledge your allegiance to the new ruler, which meant you have to go back. Now, if you're a small nomadic tribe, that's not a problem. But if you are the general of a mounted horse army that is clear across Asia, that becomes a major problem. And so what ends up happening is Genghis Khan goes back. Eventually he passes away. His son Batu Khan picks up the mantle. And then there's more pledges of allegiance to Batu Khan as the warlord. It takes about 14 years for him to get back. All right. So now Batu Khan finishes the job that his dad started. Okay. Here's what's the other thing that's really important. Take a look at the Byzantine Empire. It's shrinking. Take a look at the Holy Roman Empire. It's shrinking. Okay? Very important. The Russians, or the Slavs, they are conquered by the Mongols. Alexander Nevsky in the north decides to pledge his allegiance. But in the south, there's a little bit more conflict. And so the Mongols decide, well, we're not really comfortable with Kiev being the capital. As a matter of fact, Kiev is located right here. We need something in the center, and we need something small. We need something insignificant that we can control. So they picked out a little hamlet. That name of that hamlet has major reverberations in history also. It's now called Moscow. So that's how Moscow got its start. Coincidentally, this area called, a little city called Sarai, that was the regional headquarters for that particular area of the Mongol Empire that ruled the Slavs. The second thing that happened is you have this massive power vacuum happening over here. And what ends up happening is you're starting to see the formation of the Baltic states, and Poland and Lithuania over here. That's going to have a major impact on history later on. All right, we're looking at, finally, after about 240, 250 years or so, there was a leader in Kiev who decides, I'm not going to pay any more tribute. Well, what was the tribute at that point? Well, it was three things: gold, horses, and women. All right, why gold? Well, that's self-explanatory. Why horses? Well, if you have a horse army, you want to have lots of horses. Why women? You want to have somebody you can put on those horses. And you can't really take the Slavs and put them on a horse. You need to raise those particular children from birth. And to birth them, you need women. So that's why, one of the reasons, ancient societies, they would sometimes take, and very often would take, the women. Because that was an excellent way for the victor to keep the population of the new subjugated country or group down, while at the same time increasing their population. In any case, this is logic. I'm sorry if some people may not necessarily like that, but that's how things were done in the past. All right. The other thing is, so he decides, okay, I'm not going to pay tribute anymore. What was the name of that leader? Oh, it was Ivan III. In Russian, he's called Ivan Kalita, or Ivan the Collector, because he was very effective at collecting taxes. And during that particular time, with all of the tribute, i.e. particularly the money and the horses flowing through Moscow, Moscow started to gain prominence, and it started to gain a lot of influence. Okay, so now we get to 1940, or 1480 over here. And what do the Mongols do? Well, their natural reaction is, we're going to send our horse army, and we're going to collect the tribute. Okay, so they get General Ahmed. Ahmed it's not Ahmed Khan, it's Ahmed. Sometime between that particular time, the Mongols accepted Islam as the predominant religion. Okay, well, let's go ahead and continue on. They show up, and the Russians march forward, and the Russians try to get some help from Lithuania, which is actually becoming a dominant power, in that particular time. And the Mongols move forward. There are a couple of skirmishes that lasted about 4 days, and Ivan Kalita does something wise. He realizes, I've got a foot army, and they're not going to be very effective against mounted archers who can simply ride away. So he sets up on one side of the river Urga. The Mongols set up on the other side. Well, the Mongols tried to shoot their arrows, but the river was too wide. So if the Mongols want to go to the right, the Russians would go to the right. If the Mongols want to go to the left, the Russians would go to the left. All right, so they're standing there and they're looking at each other. And, which is why it's referred to as the Great Stand on the Urga River, or that particular battle. The Russian, Ivan Kalita, he realizes, okay, this is now October 28th. And in a short time, the river is going to freeze over, and I'm going to have massive problems with the Mongols. So he goes out and sets up in a more defensible position. At the same time, General Ahmed gets word that he's having problems in the rear with some kind of a revolt, and that there's also a problem of feeding the horses and disease. So he picks up and he leaves. Was there a major engagement? No. Tactically, I give this to the Russians because they had enough sense to use terrain. Operationally, it's an absolute draw. There was no battle, no major battle, no fight. Strategically, the Russians won because the Russians did not have to pay tribute because the Mongols could not force them to pay tribute. Very important. Okay, we're going to continue on. Now what we're looking at is the effect of that major split and the effect of Poland and Lithuania becoming major powers. And at the same time also Sweden became a major power. And what is the effect of that? The effect is from the start of the mid, let's say, 1500s on through World War I, there are 23 wars. This is only half of them. And this is in the West. That means there was a war starting approximately one every 13 years. And some of those wars were quick. Some of them lasted for a generation or so. Now what happens? From a psychological perspective, you're going to have people who are drafted, they go to war, and if they're lucky, they come back. And so now they're veterans of a war. They have families, and there's no iPhone, there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio. What do people do, especially veterans? If anybody knows me, they tell you war stories. And the war stories are continuing on. And they go on for years until the next war happens. And of course, by this time, the little boys who were sitting at the feet of their grandfather and father were listening to the war stories, so they get to experience that. And who is the bad guy for this war story? Well, if you live in here, in Poland and Lithuania, it's the Russians. If you're the Swedes, it's the Russian. If you're the Ottomans, it's the Russians. But what if you're the Russians? The bad guy are the Swedes, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Ottomans, or what today are the Turks. Very important. Now, if you think Lithuania or Sweden did not affect things that are happening in Ukraine or in that formation, well, let's take a look at just one and mention just one brief battle. How many of you have heard of the Battle of Poltava? This was the Swedes invading, and it happened right about here, east of Kiev. Not to the north, not to the south, and not to the west, but east of Kiev. Very important. And that was during the Great Northern War. All right, we're going to continue on, and we're going to take a look at what's going on in the south, in the southern wars, and most of them are against the Ottoman Empire. And what that basically means is this was a part of the push for the Russians to get to the Black Sea. Now, this map that you're seeing on the right is from approximately early 17 or late 1870s. 1870s. Now, here's the important thing. All of this Kiev, which is located right about here, and then this area right here, look at the coloration, difference in coloration between this area right here and this area right here. This is going to come into play because this is the self-identification of people of whom they believed that they were back in the early 1870s. Okay? And here, this right over here is the result of the major Russian push by the Tsars to get to a warm city port, and with the resettlement of culturally Russians and religiously Russians. Whereas if you compare that, this area right here used to be Poland and Lithuania. Okay, that for propagandists, that sets up something that can be used as diversive propaganda, or abused as diversive propaganda. All right, the World War I. I list World War I on here, but World War I, there's a debate whether it lasted until 1917 or 1918. Why? Because the Russian Empire imploded in 1917. And there were two revolutions and a civil war that started during that time. There was also a difference, and the Russians during World War I had, in essence, three fronts. You had the front against Germany, you had another front against the Austro-Hungarians, and a third front against the Ottomans over the Caucasus. The results and the effectiveness of the Russian army against on those three fronts was very different. Against the Germans, there was relative parity in trench warfare with everything that it entailed. Against the Austro-Hungarians, during the war, the Russians were able to breach the Austro-Hungarian line with a 30-kilometer breach, but they never exploited it. Because they never exploited it, the Austro-Hungarians were able to bring up reinforcements, but after that, the Austro-Hungarians were not the force to be reckoned with, as they were at the start of the war. Against the Ottomans in the Caucasus, the Russians were a lot more successful, and they had crossed the Caucasus by 1918. Now, and at about 1918, in essence, the fighting stopped on the Russian side. All right, let's contrast that with what's happened in the East. This handsome gentleman that you see is Yermak Timofeyevich. Yermak Timofeyevich, he was an explorer. But unlike the European explorers, he took a band of 50 Cossacks and started exploring west of the areas to the east. He would go to an area, claim it, and nobody really objected because it was sparsely populated, until he found one relatively large region, tried to claim it. The locals objected. They chased him. He decided to swim over a river to escape with his life. That was smart, but what was not smart was continuing to wear this armor that he was wearing. And wearing armor while swimming rapids is not real smart. He drowned. End of that. The other war, which is the Russo-Japanese War, even though that war happened on the east, all right, that was a Western war. And why? Well, it's real simple. Empire Japan was starting to warm up to Great Britain. And at the end of the Franco-German War, the French did not like the Germans did not like the French. This is common sense. But you have to look in the 1870s that at that point Great Britain was fairly neutral and kind of okay with Germany, as was Russia, or Imperial Russia. That changed in about the next 20 to 30 years, and Russia started to warm up to the French, and as were Great Britain. And Kaiser Wilhelm's thinking, well, my relations with all of the nations around me is starting to sour. How can I fix that? Well, let me see. Maybe if I can get France and England into a war with each other, okay, that would work. And then I can come to rescue the Brits, because I like them more than the French. But how am I going to do that? Well, I have this personal relationship with Tsar Nicholas, or Emperor Nicholas. I can convince him to attack France, or Empire Japan. At that point, it was mostly an economic issue, the economic dominance, primarily of the Korean Peninsula. But, against the advice of his advisors, Tsar Nicholas went to war against Japan. History says 2 Russian fleets got sunk, and eventually both sides actually reached the culminating point, which means that they reached a point after which they could neither support operations. But because there were also the problems internally within Russia on that particular year, the entire Russia ceded and left. Part of that was not just the economic dominance, but also several islands north of Japan went over to the Japanese. Okay, World War II. I'm only listing 1 year for World War II for the Soviet Union in the East. Why? Well, the Soviet Union was busy, with Germany, Nazi Germany. And what about the Japanese? They were busy, with the Americans in the Pacific. Neither wanted to open up another front. So even though they were technically enemies, they both, by agreement, chose not to initiate operations against each other until August 8, 1945. Two things happened. First, the second atomic bomb went off. Second, Stalin declared war on Japan. And by this time, the Soviet Union was ready to start moving resources into the, towards the Pacific, and America was already doing the same. So about 2 weeks later, total surrender of the Japanese, which also meant that the Soviet Union reclaimed some of the islands back from Japan. Okay, we're going to continue on over here, and we're getting close to the end. And remember I mentioned that Germany, there was in essence parity, and Austro-Hungarians were not the power to remember. This is a really obscure map, because if you take a look, this is Germany after more or less the fighting stopped, but before the Versailles Treaty. Kind of important. As you can see, they became a force to be reckoned with, and then World War I ended, the Versailles Treaty happened, and the net result, things kind of went bad for them. Now, on the, within Russia, you had the start of the Civil War, right over here. And as you can take a look at where the lines, in essence, were, and the fact that the communists were able to control the center. So they were able to utilize the tactic of beat the whites in the east first, and then reconquer the territories in the south, which led, in essence, to the formation of the Soviet Constitution and the formation of the various Soviet socialist republics. Okay, so this actually happened. All right, World War II. The first thing that happened at the start of World War II was the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement. What's important about that? The important thing is that Poland was divided in two, and everybody talks about Nazi Germany moving in from the west into Poland. Stalin moved in also from the east. Okay, there's a reason why Hitler later on attacked Stalin, but the important thing is that what ended up happening is some of these areas right over here all of a sudden became back to the Soviet Union, and they were attached to Ukraine. Very important. Okay, 1954 rolls around. 1954 is kind of a significant year because now you have Khrushchev, who is a Ukrainian, and that has created an imbalance. And there are several stories. One is that Khrushchev got very drunk and said, "Happy birthday, Ukraine! With your independence, Crimea is now yours." But the real historical reason as to why he attached Crimea to Ukraine is because he wanted to have a parity of different ethnicities and within Ukraine. At that point, there was no real diverse of propaganda, so everybody was fine and happy with how they were living. Okay? So, we're now continuing on Commonwealth of Independent States. The Soviet Union has fallen apart, and this is, in essence, a poison pill that was written into the Soviet Constitution, granting the Soviet Socialist Republics a lot of autonomy. And what ended up happening with the fallout of the central government, that all of a sudden kicked in. So they formed a Commonwealth, but a Commonwealth is not very effective because in a Commonwealth, each country conducts its own international affairs. They have their own currency and they have their, their own armies. Whereas in a very loose alliance. We experimented in America also with a Commonwealth after we won our Civil War. And the net result was some of these states almost went to war with each other prior to the Constitution, and then that was changed. But in any case, that in essence brings us to the final slide. And what you can see over here, and this is kind of key. Take this area right over here, used to be Lithuania, Poland. This is also kind of a historical line of where Orthodoxy and Catholicism. So now you have the formation of a Teutonic plate. And again, where two Teutonic plates meet up, you're going to have friction. And this is actually documented with a survey done by Max Fisher from the Washington Post for late 2013. What we're looking at is who won the elections and where the demonstrations were. Now, if you're saying 20%, it was the vote was 40 to 60. That's not necessarily the case. In some of the solid blue areas or the solid yellow areas, the vote was 90 to 10 for either the pro-European or for Yanukovych, in essence, the pro-Russian view. So you had a division starting to form back at that particular time, which set up the situation where Kiev, which was right over here, and interesting historical note, Kiev, during the start of the Mongol invasion, at one point, Kiev even considered becoming a Catholic city and switching from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. They never did, but if you do enough digging in history, you will find some of that. So, in essence, now what you have is 2014, and you have 1,000 years of history affecting a certain region of the world. And this picture is from about 2014. Now, what's interesting is take a look at the flags in this picture. This is the same time, same country, just different regions. And this is how the people see themselves. Now, there's a lot more that has happened since then, and that is way beyond this particular presentation. Some of it is going to be extremely contentious, if Margarita would like, I can definitely prepare something like that. But I may want to ask permission to wear the chainmail that is on display in the library for that, or in the museum for that. At this point, are there any questions? All right. Yeah.
So the picture to the right comes from the eastern regions of Ukraine?
Yes, it comes from the eastern regions. I believe this flag is one of the oblasts. I think it's Donetsk Oblast, and then and then the other thing is right over here. This is obviously from Ukraine, and Slava Ukraina, written in Ukraine, or glory to Ukraine. Anybody else? All right, in that case, I would like to... Yes?
Can you say a few words about the treatment of Ukraine by the Soviets in like the 1930s?
Oh, absolutely. That's actually, and let me go back a couple of slides over here. If if you take a look right over here, the Soviets, after they won the Civil War, they needed to build the country. So what Lenin decided to do is he came up with, I believe, a program called NEP, which was designed to let commerce go and let the people start working and get some kind of normalcy in life. What ended up happening is about 10 years later, because that lasted for about 2 5-year periods, you now had a discussion between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, who were still loosely unified within the Soviet Union. And Mensheviks were represented by Trotsky, Bolsheviks by Stalin. Stalin, they both agreed that the next step would be industrialization. But they both knew that the industrialization period would be extremely difficult and extremely painful for the people. So they started to debate, and the position of Trotsky was, we need to tell the people and we need to convince the people that this is best. What Stalin's position was, forget about the people, we're just going to do it. Stalin won, Trotsky lost, ended up in Mexico City, assassinated by Stalin's security services. Now, the net result of what happened is when you have to start feeding and building the factories, those workers over there need food. Ukraine during that particular time was the breadbasket of Europe, particularly prior to World War I. And so a lot of the food would have to come from Ukraine. Not every Ukrainian or person that lived, and I'm not saying just Ukrainians up here, I'm also saying the people in this area. So everybody, they did not want to leave their particular farms. They did not want to go work and support the industrialization of the Soviet Union. They just wanted to live their lives, make money, and that's basically it. Stalin decided that what he needed to do was to force the people to the point where he enforced starvation to try to force the people off the land, to the point where in some of the family plots there would be a truck driving up, stripping the topsoil off the farm in order to force the people off the land. In net result, 10 million people died in what is currently Ukraine. Now, when you're looking at this from a psychological operational perspective, you have the orders coming out of Moscow. And in what you have happening is you have a number of people starting to blame the Russians because the orders are coming out of Moscow. We're not going to talk about the fact that Stalin was a Georgian, but then again, that's history. That, in essence, kind of sets the stage where absolutely everybody, even who lived in this particular area or has ancestors from this particular area, has a real bad taste either about Moscow or the Russians, especially if you are in one of these particular areas. And so I hope that answers your question.
Is 10 million a real number or?
That's a real number.
Real number.
Not an estimate?
Not an estimate.
What about the deaths across Soviet Union because of that same policy? Do you know the numbers there?
There are, after or during the First World War and so on, there are about 20 million. Then in the other intermediary period, because it's not just the Ukrainians that actually died. And then there was another 20 million that were in essence killed or ended up dying in concentration camps. The Black Book of Communism actually goes into pretty good detail of that. as to what the exact numbers are. But it only deals with that information up until, I believe, 1978. So it doesn't really cover what happened to my wife's family and via Pol Pot.
Now, during the Stalin purges of 37 and 38, were, in terms of numbers, I know it decimated the upper echelons of Stalin's government at the time, but is it around 700,000 or 800,000, something like that, people perished?
Yeah,
at that time?
yeah, that would be included, and probably the one general that exemplifies what actually happened would be a Russian general by the name of Alexander Andreevich Sveshin, and he was actually a cavalry. In essence, started out as a imperial Russian officer, served as a company commander during the Russo-Japanese War, then as on the front lines during war, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian. Then he ended up being with the White forces. He spent some time as a concentration camp. He was let out, and coincidentally, they made him a divisional commander, in the Red Army, and then subsequently had a teaching position, and he was caught up in the purges. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of the tactics and strategy that is currently employed by the Russian army today, and also some of the Warsaw Pact armies, are based on his book called Strategy. It's the best way to compare that is you had Sun Tzu, from the Chinese, then you had Clausewitz, who was German, and from the what Sveshin does is he takes what Clausewitz wrote and he updates that, because Clausewitz talks about, in essence, annihilating the opposing force, whereas Sveshin talks about going back and forth between annihilation and attrition, because annihilation of the opposing force may not necessarily be possible. But he was actually caught up in the purges that you're actually talking about, and I believe in 1938 he actually perished. There any other questions? Okay. Okay, thank you. I can see Margarita is over here. She's starting to look at various implements of war from a long, long time ago, if I continue on much longer. Yeah, and so what I'd like to do is, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for the very good questions. And I'd also like to thank the Russian Museum of Culture, Russian Center, and Margarita in particular for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present this.
Дорогие друзья, пожалуйста, здесь люди уже знают, что надо бы стульчики убрать, столы поставить, и после этого можно будет еще, наверное, поговорить, правильно? Уже за пирожками. Спасибо, Катя, я вижу, вы привезли пирожки.
Вот, да,